Hello and welcome, everybody. It is another episode of Real Israelis, Real Lives, a brand new initiative that we have started in light of October 7th. I am Rabbi Mark Fishman from Congregation Shah HaShamayim, and this is a project of the Shah Learning Center. Today, I am joined with an exceptional person and very dear friend, Maurice Hirsch, who is the director of the Initiative for Palestinian Authority Accountability and Reform in the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. As well as being the director of that program, Maurice Hirsch is more formally introduced as Lieutenant Colonel Reserved Maurice Hirsch, is a lawyer by training and was the former chief military prosecutor for Judea and Samaria, as well as a host of other responsibilities. Most significantly, and to turn our attention to our discussion today, Maurice, you were critically important. You're humble, so you'll probably change my title, but I believe critically important in determining a final list of terrorists who were to be included in the prisoner swap, in the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap, in order to bring one Israeli hostage back home to Israel. Since that time, you have been intimately involved at the highest levels of the army and in the halls of the Knesset concerning such matters. And it's a pleasure having you here with us today. And I want to get straight to my first question, which is, in your opinion, in your informed opinion, with your experience, what is the lay of the land today concerning the hostages? First of all, do we know if they are alive? Do we know anything about their well-being? And what, in your opinion, does it look like in terms of what will happen next?
So thank you, Rabbi Fishman, for the introduction. You're quite right. Your descriptions of my involvement in the different activities is of course exaggerated, but I'll try and give you some of an input. I was in way or another, one way or another, connected to almost every single one of the deals to release prisoners by the Israeli government for whatever reason it is for almost 2 decades. And also in my last position as the head of the prosecution for rearresting many of the Shalit terrorists who were released and then breached their terms of their pardon or of their conditional pardon after the kidnapping and murder of the 3 teens in Gush Etzion in the summer of 2014. The subject of the hostages at the moment, just for those who don't know, Hamas, as part of that onslaught on the 7th of October, Hamas and other terrorist organizations, including the PFLP, an organization that is connected to Mahmoud Abbas's PLO, took at least 239 hostages into Gaza. I say at least 239 because we don't know a final number. The Israeli authorities are very cautious to give any number whatsoever until they have really perfect confirmation that that's what we're talking about, someone kidnapped as opposed to someone who is just missing. We don't know anything about the hostages, or we have very little information that at least that can be shared. We've seen 4 hostages being released so far. They were over and above the 239, and another one soldier being rescued in what was clearly a heroic rescue. Very little information about that being given out as to how exactly we got to her and what information was given out. But just from the descriptions that have been made public already, we can understand that we're in quite a difficult situation. One of the 4 hostages released said clearly that she had been abducted by the terrorists, put on a motorbike, driven across the fields and taken into the Hamas tunnels. Hamas has 500 kilometers of tunnels under Gaza. That's a lot of mileage, and a lot of place to hide many of the hostages. We know that they were kept, according to that testimony, separately. They weren't all kept in one group. So talking about an Entebbe-style raid to overpower the terrorists and heroically walk out with everyone, I think is going to be almost impossible. And so I think we're going to find ourselves in a very difficult situation. We have no information as to whether the hostages are alive or dead, how many of them are alive, how many of them are dead. We are expecting, as we already have seen, use and abuse of the hostages for psychological warfare purposes. We saw the video of 3 hostages explaining joyfully how they're fine and they're being treated well, and they're just critical of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, when really, when you open the frame, you can clearly see the terrorists with their guns pointing at these poor women, really forcing them under God knows what threat to say what they've been told to say. Obviously, in what is a very poor attempt at what's called Pallywood, and really just the created idea of these are the free and willful given testimonies of these poor hostages. So that's what we're seeing. Israeli forces. We know that there are Israel has set 2 fundamental goals for the war in Gaza. One is to destroy Hamas, and the other is to bring home the hostages. Hopefully all alive, or as many as are alive are still alive as possible. That's the goal. What will actually be, I think it's very hard to assess at this time.
You mentioned that for the last 20 years, you have directly had some hand in every hostage swap and the release of terrorist prisoners back to these terrorist organizations. Is there a willingness today for the government to be prepared to swap people who are currently sitting, terrorists who are currently sitting in Israeli prisons, for hostages, whether that be one or a number of hostages?
I would say that the answer to that should be, in principle, absolutely not. Any release of terrorists at the moment would be seen as a prize for the October 7 massacre, and it doesn't matter whether it brings about the release of hostages. What the terrorist organizations are looking for is that picture of victory, seeing terrorists walking free out of prison in return for any of the hostages will be that picture of victory, and therefore it's something which really, as difficult as it may seem, shouldn't in any way be entertained. Having said that, there are possible options that could be on the table. For example, if we were talking about the release of all of the hostages in return for prisoners that would be ending their sentence in the next 6 months, that would possibly not be something which, again, terrorists that will in any case be released. So I don't think that would necessarily be the worst possible outcome. Mm-hmm. But having said that, knowing the terrorists, that they're not interested in that. They're not really interested in any type of reasonable discussion. All they're interested in doing is abusing the hostages in order to bring about the release of every single one of the terrorists, which is obviously something that cannot be entertained when you take into account, Rabbi Frischman, that the people who led this attack, who led the October 7th massacre, were predominantly people released in the deal to free Gilad Shalit. People like Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, was released as part of that deal. Other terrorists, Ali Kadri, who was the head of the Nukhba forces for the central area, those forces that attacked the Supernova party, Nature Party, he was also released. He had been convicted for the murder of Sasson Nouriel, an Israeli, his employer, in 2005. And he had literally broadcast live the execution. He was then released as part of the deal to Gaza to free Gilad Shalit, and he came back as one of these mass murderers. So of those released in the different deals, over 50% returned to terrorism. There's no idea of rehabilitation. These were terrorists, they remain terrorists, and their goal is to murder as many Jews as possible. So releasing terrorists again, I think, would be folly, a bad idea, and something which would only result in the death of more Jews.
I thank you. I read in the newspapers, I'm follow whichever news outlets I'm reading, there seems to be two possibilities. Maybe you can shed light on this, maybe there's more, of how the hostages can be brought home. One option is that there are dealings and discussions with Qatar, that the leadership in Qatar somehow or other hold either the financial resources or the financial power to effect a hostage release, or secondly, that it will simply be through the efforts of the IDF that they will be going in to locate them and bringing them home, having the Israeli army take care of this themselves. First of all, my question is, are those two options accurate? I don't know. Is that a correct assessment? And through which other means can these hostages come home?
So I think that those are options that have been discussed extensively in the press. The Qatari option has come up with, literally over the last 2 weeks, half a dozen different scenarios, half a dozen different suggestions, all designed really by the terrorist organizations and their supporters, Qatar, in order to carry out this psychological warfare against Israel and really against the world. This is something which should not and cannot be tolerated. It has to be understood. The goal of, or the idea of releasing terrorists as part of a deal doesn't sit with the goal of destroying Hamas. Those two don't go together. If your goal is to destroy Hamas entirely, if Yahya Sinwar knows that he is a dead man walking, that he will never be allowed to put his head above ground again without 50 IDF soldiers filling it with lead, then we failed at some type of messaging in order to convey the seriousness and the gravity of the decision, and really the extent of Israel's commitment to destroy Hamas. By releasing terrorists, we give our enemies, we give Sinwar the hope at the end of the tunnel that his actions have some type of fruit. That's something which we cannot do at all. And so whilst there are all types of ideas being floated, the most, I would say the most despicable of them being that Israel released terrorists in order to bring about the release of foreign citizens only, is something which is morally defunct. Israel cannot allow itself to endanger its security in order to only release foreign citizens, even those who have dual citizenship, whilst at the same time neglecting and really betraying its own citizens. So those ideas that are being thrown out are I would say, a non-starter, and should be entirely rejected by Israel.
How, in your opinion, does this end?
This ends, I fear, with the IDF soldiers locating the hostages all through these tunnel networks and releasing them by force, by no other means that would grant the terrorists in Gaza any type of light at the end of the tunnel. They have to know, and they should know, that There is only one way out for them, and it's death.
Does the army have a mathematical assessment as to how many hostages they think that they will be able to bring home alive?
I would say no. I don't think that's even something that the army would consider. Also, based on the fact that we're not even certain 100% how many hostages are being held. So the goal is to bring home every single one of the 239 hostages that we are at least certain are in the hands of the terrorists in Gaza, and nothing less than that.
As we close, is there any optimism that you see? Is there any hope? Is there any sense we're wringing our hands? People are saying, what can we do? To the viewers who are watching in Canada or wherever they may be, or listening to this around the world, is there any sense of that this can end well, or a sense of hope that you can leave us with?
So I would give two messages. One regarding the war and one additional one. Regarding the war, it has to be understood that whilst Israel suffered a terrible blow on the 7th of October, that has brought us to the understanding that we can no longer tolerate the existence of these genocidal terrorist organizations living next door us and constantly on a daily basis threatening our well-being and our lives. That is something that has to end. So whilst this process started with the blackest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, it will hopefully end with the obliteration of the Gazan terrorists and Hamas in general, also in Judea and Samaria. And let's not forget, after the Munich massacre, Israel hunted down and executed every single one of those Black September terrorists who were involved. The Hamas leadership abroad should know also their days are over as well. They're dead men walking. And that should be a ray of hope for us going forward, that we will finally be rid of these terrorists who have murdered thousands of Jews simply because they're Jews. So that's the ray of hope going forward. It's gonna come with a cost, but at the end of the day, the world will be a better place for it, not only Israel. The second message that I would say, Rabbi Fishman, and you know me, and I will apologize for this message from the start. You know what I'm about to say. Jews around the world need to come home. Israel needs you. This is your homeland, even though we are in really not pleasant times at the moment. This is where the Jewish people belong, and this is where long term, this is where you'll be safe. I know that sounds crazy at the moment after the October 7th massacre, but I wholeheartedly believe that the Jews around the world are seeing this upspike in vile anti-Semitism. It's something which, after the massacre, should have brought on sympathy and empathy and really the opposite of what we're seeing today. But we're seeing the depth and of this Jew hatred around the world, and long term, the Jewish future is in Israel. So that would be my second message. Come to Israel. There's place here for everyone. We're trying to keep everyone safe, and that's the only way forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maurice Hirsch. We appreciate your voice, your opinion, and the informed place of understanding of where that comes from. Thank you so much for joining us today, and may we hear better news.
Thank you for having me, and Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.